right? So I got to tell you, for people to think about who I am, I'm a civil rights oriented person. I began in private practice, actually, doing intellectual property litigation and First Amendment work, media law and defamation cases. But I had a calling to go to the Department of Justice. I really revere the Charles Hamilton Houstons of the world. I really revere the people who were strategic enough to not only believe in something and believe in what America could be, not only on paper, but in the trajectory, and to make the two be reconciled that we have right now. And so when I had an opportunity to join the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, for me, it was the ultimate source of pride that here I was going to be in a position to advance and advocate the seminal legislation of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But I can tell you, even at that time, and mind you, I was one of maybe the urban legend. I knew no one in the Department of Justice. I applied through USA Jobs. I threw my hat into that sort of proverbial needle into the haystack. And I can tell you, I'm very persuasive in trying to break through. And if there's a little bit of a crack in the door, I will get my whole body into it and then stay. And that was one of those instances. I could tell you that story for a different time about how that worked, but I was in the room where it would happen. And I intended to carry on that work. But even then, when I was there, I was hired under the Bush administration, the year that Obama would be in his first presidential election. And so I had the opportunity to see from the Republican administration to a Democratic administration. And even then, we had the benefits of Section 5 and the pre-clearance requirement and authorization. We had a not yet rendered anemic Section 2 from this now Supreme Court. And it was difficult and bureaucratic even then. You can imagine the same issues plaguing a department about the perception of being partisan, about the idea of people having their thumb on the scale, and frankly, wanting to have a vested interest that would be realized in terms of what work we would be doing. I found that I was not as drawn to the policy as I was to the day-to-day tangible activity. And so I thought that even under the same umbrella of the Justice Department, going to be a criminal prosecutor at the U.S. Attorney's Office would be able to have an opportunity to pursue and maybe eventually catch justice as well. And I can tell you, it was a really jarring experience, Fred, to go from, and I don't think I'm a naive person or have rose-colored glasses, but there is a real distinction between the work one does as a civil rights advocate and one as a prosecutor, even though you are responsible for the preservation of civil rights.
And as I'm thinking about what you had to do to make your way into the prosecutor's office, and it was what many of us would call a good job, but you walked away from it. And so why did you feel you had to leave justice in order to pursue justice?
As my mom would call it, my good government job. You got to add that, good government job, right? It's continued a joke to this day. Well, for me, one, I've never really been afraid to walk away when I think that my moral compass is no longer aligned. I think we all really have to continue to have that sense of resolve because we don't want to be tied with the golden handcuffs of money or with the expectation that you started something, so you must complete if you do not believe that the work you're doing is going to be as advantageous. And for me, I questioned and grappled with that. And I write about it in the book, the idea of, was I better serving the justice system, which is far often a legal system rather than a justice system, as somebody from within, as a bit of a gatekeeper and somebody exercising the discretion in a way that I think was honorable, or from the outside, being able to be and using activism in the form of education information. And for me, I resolved that the latter was more important. And I also had, there were moments when I was having these personal battles of allegiance. And, none of us, I'm sure you can attest to this, and everyone is part of this particular conversation, none of us have the luxury, and perhaps you never wanted, the luxury of shedding your identity at the door of whatever door frame you walk through, be it a courtroom or a boardroom or a classroom or anything else. I come as I am, with the lived experience as a Black woman and wife and mother and human being and student of history. And when you don't shed those aspects, you find yourself grappling with the tensions that come into play when they are at odds with the directions you are given. And I found myself often grappling with how this would be resolved. And really, I found more often than not, there were moments of triumph and humanity, but there are also the realization, Fred, that the pursuit of justice can create injustice. And that's a reality we must know about.
And it's a reality that comes through very strongly in the book. And so before I dig more into the book, let me just talk a little bit about how you made your way into CNN, and what did you feel you'd be able to accomplish there?
Again, there was a cracked door. I'm kidding. There was a crack, and really, honestly, to tell you the truth, I had no way. When I walked away from the Justice Department, and I'm a bit of a drama queen, and I believe in symbolism. So my last day, I remember, was the Martin Luther King holiday for me to say "free at last," and it was one of those moments I said to everyone, "Free at last, excuse me, goodbye," and people laughed at me. They thought, I ever had a supervisor say to me, "Laura, you're leaving? Do me a favor. And I want you to write your recommendation or write your review for this year. So when you come back next year, I'll already have it written." Which, of course, for somebody like me, I'm sure you can attest to, when you have a naysayer, it's often a catalyst. And it's not that I was intent on proving someone wrong, but I was betting on myself. And I really wanted to remove the muzzle of what I had learned, the intersection of police-involved shootings and encounters and voting rights and issues about Fourth Amendment violations. And so when I walked away, I had no plan other than to make a plan and figure out how I would use my voice without the muzzle of the federal government, which is required. And I posted up in a Panera bread. And I mean, really, the Panera with like the fireplace, and they had the tea station, and I nursed my cup of tea for hours on end and had a scone. And I had a virtual newborn. My daughter was only about 6 months, and I had her in the little crib, the carrier next to me, and I'd be nursing, figuring out how I'm supposed to do this. And I said, I got to figure out a way to use my voice and the right platform. And so I began writing, and I began thinking about it, and I began making contacts and eventually ended up in radio and SiriusXM. And that led me to CNN as well. And so really it's been a combination of serendipity and grit and determination, but also just knowing that sometimes you have the goal and you have to work backwards. And I did that at Panera. And I appreciate them still for not charging me for all the cups of tea that I consumed. So thank you.
And this, okay, Panera it is. Now I know. Now I know.
I wasn't thinking that. Sorry, but it's true.
No. The next time I get stuck, I'm going to Panera.
Nope, go to Panera. Get some tea. It was orange pico.
Okay, I got a new tea too. So in addition to Panera, let's start digging more into the book. So what inspired this book, and when did you start writing it at Panera?
I did write it, but I'm telling you, they have a whole setup for me there. It was wonderful. No, I wrote a lot journaling while I was at the U.S. Attorney's Office as well, just thinking about and remembering moments really as a catharsis, and really trying to sometimes grapple with the insomnia that pursuing justice frankly brings. And I'm not a robot. I really am a whole human being who has difficulty at times compartmentalizing and juggling with, should I compartmentalize or should I just feel? Is it better for me to feel and let it rise to the surface, or for me to sort of relegate the emotion and deal with the objectivity of it? And I really try to balance that all the time. And so I would use what I wrote in my journals and also my really vivid memory of what happened, because, I don't want to in any way suggest that my experience is somehow a higher priority than those people who actually experienced and were victims of the crimes, or those who were really on a different side of the justice system and on the other side of the V. But you experience a kind of secondary trauma. You experience a kind of vicarious experience that you can't necessarily anticipate. And so I would often write about that and trying to make sense, frankly, as I was talking to the nation through CNN about these conversations in the zeitgeist. I was at the same time working through these personified experiences and frankly, looking at my children who were asking questions. And I wanted to be able, which is why I chose to focus this book in the moments there in the years that I was carrying my stair-step babies, are about 18 months apart. They're now 9 and 7. and thinking about, I wanted them to understand what I was carrying, Fred, while I was carrying them.
And when you think about which event in Just Pursuit made you first begin to question the criminal justice system, and what truths did you find?
I would say day one in a criminal courtroom will force you to accept the difference between what you know and what you understand.
Yeah.
And, I talk about in the introduction, a colleague of mine sort of foreshadowed, he said, Coates, don't leave Main Justice. That's where you think about in terms of where you have the Civil Rights Division, Main Justice, as opposed to the satellite U.S. Attorney's offices. And he said, you're not going to be able essentially to deal with the human misery day to day. And I thought to myself, well, that's pretty naive of him, because isn't the job of a prosecutor through the pursuit of justice to resolve that human misery, to be able to help people through that? Because I was thinking, I think in some respects of justice as a binary concept, that their justice could be pursued through the trial, through a verdict, conviction, or acquittal. And I knew conceptually, obviously, what disproportionate impact was, what mass incarceration was, and the impact of the 13th Amendment and beyond on our justice system and our criminal code. I knew that intellectually, and I believed I understood it empathically. However, I compare it in many respects, Fred, to the first day in the criminal courtroom and seeing the parade of Black and brown people as victims, as defendants. And I can tell you, over the really hundreds and thousands of cases that I would see and look at, my own and others, I can count on one hand, and I don't even require every single finger to count the number of white defendants I saw in Washington, D.C. And I would actually ask, I remember my first day, I said, where are the white people? And I think my colleagues said, oh, Laura, you're going crazy. I said, no, seriously, that's a real question, not rhetorical, but where are the white people? And one said, on the bench. And I thought to myself in those moments of, my God, what? And I compare it to, almost like a train platform where you're standing on a train. You know, of course, the ferocity of a train. You can imagine the power of those pistons, and you can imagine the speed at which it travels. You know that. But until you're on the platform and you feel one whiz by you, and you actually can feel the reverberations of its impact, and you take that step back and it takes your breath away for a moment. That's what I think about, the knowing about justice in America and beginning to understand that first day.
Yeah. And so when you're thinking about, any regrets or hopes from your experiences, or share some of the hardest or easiest parts of the book to revisit, because I know there must have been some parts that were just rough.
There were more moments of where I sort of had to curate the stories that I would tell, right? I mean, you can imagine there are many more in my memory and in my heart about what happened, but I really chose these stories because they personified issues that we're talking about, from the idea of victim blaming and the statement in the Me Too era of believe women, and what that looks like in the court of public opinion versus what it looks like in a court of law. And the face of a victim blamer or shamer might surprise you, to the ideas of, we hear oftentimes in the news about those who've been exonerated, and don't think about those blink moments in the infancy of a case where somebody second guessing and somebody taking the time to believe that maybe the officers did get this wrong, and what impact that could have. I write about the interaction between our immigration policy in this country and our view of criminalizing undocumented persons, and how we sometimes equate those with people who have committed violent crimes. And is there an injustice in that? I go through the voting rights cases, and I talk about it, and it was very difficult at times to revisit it. I found myself, thank God it's not literally a pen to paper, because I was weeping it sometimes, remembering it. At times my husband would say, you gotta take a break for a second, because what's going on? And my daughter would say, I think mommy's remembering again. Because it happens from time to time when, there are moments in some of the horrific cases that I encountered, I remember details that will all of a sudden come back again. Or my daughter or my son will say something, or they'll be holding an object that I recall as evidence of somebody's abuse or an assault. And I find myself clutching them for dear life, not unlike I'm sure so many parents have, when we can't disassociate from the experience of so many Black and brown people dying at the hands of police officers. you can't hear about Elijah McClain walking in Colorado, apologizing for vomiting to these officers as he's being held down and injected with ketamine before he's rendered brain dead, and just sort of go, okay, well, that happened to him, right? These are things that come back to me. And so I would often find myself writing in the middle of the night when I was sort of, jarred out of my sleep, or in the morning, and just going through these moments. But they're difficult, but I think each of the stories in its own way is an insight, not into just me personally, but I think something we're all grappling with about these battles of allegiance.
And there's so much good storytelling and just pursuit, but also activism and telling these stories. And so do you believe we can reform the criminal justice system? And if so, where do we start?
Absolutely, I do. And the reason I am so quick with my optimism is because what choice do we have? The idea of, certainly you could try to be and say, I'm a pragmatist and this is never going to get done. Okay, well, at what points over the course of American history did us conceding defeat essentially act and end up with progress in some way, right? If the point sometimes is to put enough obstacles and hurdles in your way that you get so frustrated by the process that you will stop, well, not a lot would be getting done. You and I would not be where we are right now, sitting here today. I remember the class of '01 who adopted, so to speak, an older Princeton alum who was forced to leave the campus because he was one of the only Black people, if not the only one at the school, and what his experience was like. Well, we thanked him then, we thank him to this day, we continue to do so, because we cannot become accustomed to simply throwing up our hands and saying it's hard, therefore we shouldn't be there. We dishonor the people like him and others who tried very hard to have a seat at the table and were denied. So I think we can, but I also think we can't continue to have a constrained conversation and think that criminal justice reform only means police encounters. Right? That's not the bulk of what's happening. That is an issue. The Supreme Court's judicial doctrine of qualified immunity should be revisited, shall we say. Their Supreme Court precedent, which they seem very eager to consider and reconsider these days on very seminal cases about affirmative action or about Roe v. Wade, why not look more into, say, Graham versus Connor and the idea of having officers' actions be judged through a reasonable person standard as opposed to a reasonable officer standard, allowing prosecutors an opportunity to have a better opportunity to prove their burden, knowing that they benefit from the benefits of the doubt. How about the ideas of, if we think about the presumption of innocence, then why are we requiring people to pay for that presumption of innocence and have access outside the bail system? And also, when you think about just outside of the strictly criminal side, I mean, it's no coincidence that voting rights are removed based on one's criminal background. That's not a coincidence. It's such a powerful vote and powerful right that if they can figure out ways to circumscribe your ability and access, then that leads fewer people to be able to represent it. And so thinking about it in all these different facets are important. And really, I wrote the book you mentioned, Storytelling. It was intentional not to write a legal textbook. I remember them in law school, fabulous, wonderful, let's talk more about it. It's not the type of book I wanted to write because I get more from storytelling. I get more from the see something, say something, from the decision of Emmett Till's mother to tell the story of what injustice looked like on her son's face by showing people. I get more from the media cameras on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, or dogs attacking school children, or the look of Ruby Bridges trying to go to school, or the camera held by, in my hometown, a young 16-year-old girl, Darnella Frazier, 17-year-old Darnella Frazier, showing the world what a murder looked like of George Floyd. And so I think that people are able to understand and feel more when they are vicariously experiencing and seeing it for themselves. And I think you'll find in my world, that makes all the difference.
And when I'm thinking about your worlds, because you occupy many worlds, you first worked in the Civil Rights Division with voting rights as a voting rights attorney. Then you became an assistant United States prosecutor for the Department of Justice in DC. And the book covers that experience. And so how do the two relate to each other? And how do they relate to what you do now as a legal expert at CNN?
Well, I explain the law on CNN. I tell you what it is and how it's often interpreted, right? But this book tells you how the law feels and what justice feels like. And I think you don't want to just approach a deeply personal experience from 10,000 feet up, right? You want to be able for people to understand the nuance in it. And this book really attempts to do that. One of the things that I've taken away from people's responses to the book is, as I do episodically the tales, each chapter stands alone in just pursuit. And people have often spoken to me and said, you know what, I felt the consternation and the emotional turmoil, but what other choice did you have? And there was no alternative, Laura, right? In some of these instances. So you had to do what you had to do. That's different than doing the right thing, perhaps, right? What is lawful versus what is right. And we often look at this chasm between what ought to be illegal, what you think is illegal, versus what actually is. And testing at the presidential level, that no one's above the law, well, then who's under the law? Like who does it fall under at that point in time? And really the point was, in some respects, for people to, if you come to the conclusion and it's sort of a choose your own adventure, what would you have done in that circumstance? If you find yourself saying there was no alternative, but it doesn't feel right, that's where the law can be changed. That's the moment when you realize that sort of aha moment, hashtag Oprah, that aha moment that says to you essentially, what needs to be done then? Because if we are not comfortable, it doesn't mean that it's set in stone and can never be changed. Laws change all the time. So when you speak truth to power, if you know what the truth is, you are in a better position for the powers to be, if you're not already them, to change it.
And one of the things that I think in terms of speaking truth, there's something that you do in the book is you bring the truth of home together with the truth of work. And so we see you talking about your husband who goes and buys the dash cam so that in case he's pulled over, that you'll know by the police, you'll know what's going on. And we see you and your family thinking about how do you have the talk with your children should they encounter the police. And we see these issues and the difficulty of trying to sort of reconcile what it is that you're seeing at home and feeling at home with what you're having to do at work. And so how do you think about reconciling those worlds?
I don't know that I always do it very well, Fred. Sometimes I still grapple with, how to have the conversation with the world and the talk with my children. How on the one hand to, offer some semblance of optimism that the law can be changed, and then comforting my children for the status quo. And just like everyone else during this pandemic, I've been working from home. I have a studio in my home as well for television and radio. And so when my kids were in distance learning, for the love of God, they were in distance learning. I'm still recovering from that particular trauma of it all. But I would be talking and offering commentary for, say, the Derek Chauvin trial. And my children would be very close by in earshot, sometimes at my knee, looking up at me literally. And they would say, Mommy, I heard you talk about George Floyd and how he asked for his mom. Would you come if that were me? And these are the kind of conversations you think to yourself, imagine that this 9-year-old boy is seeing himself in this 40-something-year-old man who finds himself in this horrific situation. And in his young mind processing perhaps an inevitability of this, or that he might one day see himself in this, and what was I going to do about it? Or my daughter asking questions about, why does everyone say her name? Just who is Breonna Taylor? And what happened? And hearing about these stories. And so I have had, I often think about raising children. And I know it's, a fool's errand to think about it this way, Fred, but I think about raising my kids almost like when you visit a museum and you choose what wings you're going to travel through. And I think, okay, children, today's lesson is this wing, and I'm going to show you this part, and here's how this is going to go, right? And then all of a sudden, life hits you and throws you into a different wing that you were ill prepared to confront in this moment. You thought you had years before you would reach this moment in time. And we as parents and human beings don't get the luxury of delaying those conversations because it won't save them. It won't help them. There is a maturity process that is hastened in a way that makes me hurt as a woman and mother. But I tell you, perhaps selfishly, some of the work I do is in the hopes that if I provide the information, if I shed the light, if I peel back the curtain, if I explain, that it will spark somebody's activism, and that my children will learn about what I'm doing in a textbook as opposed to in their actual lives.
And so what is it that you want the reader to understand about justice and the justice system after having read Just Pursuit?
I want them to understand that there is an opportunity to be not only who we are on paper, but also to reconcile that with what we could be. And much like the practice of medicine, we still practice law, right? We practice it. And there are ways and opportunities to get it right. But one of the ways to do so is to disrupt this fallacy that Black and brown people can only fill one role within a criminal courtroom, as if it's just the defendant or a defense counsel, to really disrupt this idea that one, if you believe in civil rights, you can only be on the defense side. That in reality, it's important to have a seat at every table, but not just to sit there silently when you are, to really grab the reins and be at the helm and to bring your whole self unapologetically into those rooms, because justice is better for it. So we have to think about not only law enforcement officers and judges and members of Congress and school boards and water utility district, which is one of the reasons we have this Voting Rights Act disrupted. I mean, in instances like this, the ideas of prosecutors and defense counsel, the ideas of grassroots advocacy and beyond, we really have to think about the role of Black and brown people as being gatekeepers, as being agents of change, and as being decision makers who can exercise discretion, because the overwhelming number of cases in this country don't get run up the chain to a political appointee or an attorney general. Most of the time it's handled by individual prosecutors exercising discretion. And how they do that is often unchecked. And we cannot rely on the altruism or assumed selflessness of people. It's got to be codified, and it has to be there for representation.
And my final question for you before we turn to the audience is, when thinking about your life and work, what advice do you have for our current students who want to know what they might do to work toward justice?
I would encourage everyone to really think critically. I know that phrase is probably irritating, but to think critically about what you stand for and believe in, and not just try to fit into ready-made, prepackaged, cookie cutter professions, perhaps. There are ways for you to use your insight, your creativity, the very things that helped you to gain admission and to thrive at Princeton, has been the realization that you bring something unique and special, and there's nobody else like you. You can't wish to be someone else and they can't be you, because you have particular things you've had to overcome, things that have enhanced your life, things that are your qualities, things that are your shortcomings, and all of those combine to help you see the world in a way that we really need to learn from. And so whatever career people choose, whether it's the law, whether it's medicine, whether it's engineering, whether it's writing, whether it's figuring it out and biding yourself the time to understand, gosh, what can I do? Do that. And most importantly, I mean, I have really benefited from a sense of restlessness, of not answering the question of what do you want to be when you grow up with one answer. There are moments I pivot all throughout my life, and I encourage people to keep doing that and to not constrain yourself to just being one thing in one field. Intersectionality will be your best friend, and your mind will be the closest ally.
And with that, let me just say thank you for getting us launched. And I can see from the Q&A here at the bottom that people are ready to chat. So,
oh, well, thank you for your questions. Is it hot in here?
it's about to get hot. It's about, as we say, hot up in here. And so one person asked, what do you mean the pursuit of justice leads to injustice?
Well, I'll give you a prime example. Chapter 1 of my book, Just Pursuit. It's right here. It talks about this very issue of a run-of-the-mill car theft case where the person whose car was stolen was an undocumented person who'd been illegally living in the country for decades, had come as a teenager and had not so much as sneezed in the direction of a police officer since then. And he had an active deportation warrant that pinged when I ran a background check before trial of a case I inherited. And I write about in the chapter how, because of that active warrant, we were required to alert the immigration officials to activate deportation proceedings and have him arrested. Now imagine the idea here, if we think about justice only in terms of a verdict, the pursuit of getting a conviction of a car thief was going to create a collateral effect on somebody who was victimized. And think about the ways in which we as a society, I didn't have private clients as a prosecutor, that was private practice. I spoke on behalf of the people of the United States. And so society was offended by the car theft, not just the individual victim. And so it serves us to be able to have people cooperate with our prosecution and law enforcement to report crimes and not be met with the formidable choice of whether to come out of a shadow and explain an injustice that occurred to them in a crime, or continue to be victimized and not even alert society. And I think that speaks volumes about how the pursuit of a conviction created an imbalance and unfairness for this undocumented person. And I write about the resolution and how that happens in other instances as well.
And we have a question from Maureen. Do you think there will be more justice in New York City with the new administration, Black mayor, police commissioner, district attorney?
One would hope that there would be advancement by virtue of the fact that it's somebody who has asked for the opportunity to lead with his whole self. However, we're already seeing glimpses of concerns about reintroducing a policy involving plainclothes officers, and with an effort to get more guns off the street. And we know about the gun violence happening. We just saw today a second officer in Harlem responding to a domestic violence disturbance has now died. It's extraordinarily difficult work. And we can hope that the policies that are in place to try to ensure safe conditions in communities all across places like New York will be able to be realized. But I do have questions about the prosecutorial decisions to prosecute or charge and use the limited resources in different ways. I wonder if they will act as a deterrent or they will act to embolden either officers or criminals alike. So it remains to be seen.
And Eileen asked, if there's a crime committed, so I see murder has been, when murder's committed, Black life gets a very different penalty than white life. Our white brothers get 10, maybe 15 years when Black person gets life. Can this be changed, and if so, how?
Well, the sentencing guidelines is one way to look at this issue and think about that. Another way is through the ways which you've seen probably most recently when it comes to, and you know this, Fred, the idea of what it's like in terms of when there's a Black victim versus a white defendant, or a white victim versus a Black defendant, and the ways in which oftentimes jurors will look differently upon the crime based on the race of the victim. And this was something that was a reality that was hoped to be capitalized on in the trial of the McMichael father and son duo and their neighbor Roddy Bryant in the killing of the young jogger Ahmaud Arbery. They actually had the audacity to say that maybe the quiet part or not so quiet part out loud, to request in the voir dire that they would have more bubbas. That was their word, not mine, more bubbas on the jury. They wanted less educated. They wanted bubbas who are not college educated, because the assumption was that in a certain educational level, and the stereotypical Bubba, that they would share whatever bias the defendants did, and that the Blackness of Ahmaud Arbery would be an indictment. Now, that is something that speaks volumes about why you've got this disconnect between the penalties that are assigned. And I think the idea the Supreme Court has tried through a case called Batson to be able to remove race out of the voir dire process or jury selection. But you know how they do that? By requiring you to consider and actually document. Hold on, how many white people I struck and Black people I struck, so I can prove to you that I wasn't considering race. And I have to think of some reason. They ask me, why did you strike 17 white people or 35 Black people? You got to say, oh, it wasn't because of race. It was because they looked at me funny, or they had a question. I like their T-shirt. Real reasons you can actually give someone at a courtroom. Is that enough, do you think, to address the role of bias and racism in our justice system? I think not. And so that's just one way we can look at it. But I do think one of the first steps to answer the question in more full is for us to stop thinking about the mascot of the Justice Department, the blindfolded Lady Justice, to be somehow aspirational. Right? We actually have to see the world as it is. We all see color. We all know its impact. We know about the pig laws of the South looking to exploit through vigilante justice what couldn't be done when they accomplished the 13th Amendment. So why are you pretending that the one area in our world where race is probably the most apparent doesn't exist, and that's a virtue? I think we have to start there.
Yes, and a related question from Michael Gunter. There's a relationship between mass media and policing that shapes public narratives on crime, often with the police version of events controlling the narrative and leading to increased public sentiment for harsher punishment. So how do we introduce skepticism to these narratives and end these cycles?
I think it's important to understand, just think about how much we give a benefit of the doubt to law enforcement in this country. In a voir dire with an officer testifying, one of the questions you ask across the nation in any courtroom is, would you give more or less weight to the testimony of an officer? And it becomes almost a rhetorical question. Of course I would, because the assumption is what? An officer doesn't get up in the morning intending to harm anybody, and they wouldn't have stopped you unless you did something. The government would not be bringing a case against you unless they actually have the proof for it. And the presumptions of innocence get chipped away little by little. And so we are all, in law enforcement and prosecutors alike as well, beneficiaries of that benefit of the doubt. And I think it's incumbent upon us to be able to wield that and not capitalize and exploit that, but actually challenge the benefit of the doubt that's given. There is a healthy amount of skepticism that I think we all bring with our lived experience that we shouldn't be afraid to introduce into the courtroom or introduce in these conversations. And I think one great start was what I saw in the Derek Chauvin trial in my hometown in Minnesota, when the assumption is that officers, who, by the way, they often know the script from the Supreme Court more fluently than prosecutors and professors about what they're supposed to say to be able to demonstrate that their use of force was not questionable and certainly upheld the Fourth Amendment principles. And so because they know the script, we got to know the deal about what's being said and challenge it. And we often think because of that script, there's a sort of blue code of silence. And the Derek Chauvin trial showed through the testimony of the police chief, Arredondo, other officers who took the stand and said and challenged the notion of, I know the Supreme Court says it's a reasonable officer standard. That's normally a hypothetical of who might have been on the scene. But we were actually there, or we were people who knew better. And this is not what's supposed to happen here. The more we have those occurrences, the better we are able to really have maybe initial or restore trust in these communities.
And I'm going to move away from sort of policy for a second. And Anthony Noble has asked, in a recent interview, you talked about the importance of wearing your own jersey. Can you share with us what that means or has meant to you?
Oh, hold on, where is my jersey? Am I sitting on it? It's gonna be wrinkled now. I really do have it in my office. I literally wear my own jersey from time to time. This has Coates, as in Coates, has Minnesota in the front, which is of course where I'm from, Coates. And I put this on because look, we all need champions. And if you're lucky enough to find them outside of the universe, more power to you. And I have champions within my own family and friends. Anthony is a close friend of mine as well. And I think about my champions around around my space. But sometimes you're going to have to wear your own jersey and be your own champion and advocate for yourself in a way that your number one fan would. If you can imagine, you know, for those who are basketball fans, right? If you're wearing the LeBron James jersey, you're going to go toe to toe and challenge and advocate for him. But if you're not doing that for yourself, then you are doing yourself a disservice. And there are many moments in my life where I have had to be my own advocate and be my own champion, and not in a fearless way, because I think that's a bad assumption. I can tell you, when I've had challenges and I've had very difficult times, I didn't just keep going because I was fearless. I was just willing to do it afraid. And because I was wearing my own jersey, to say, I'm going to bet on myself. I'm going to sit in Panera with my Princeton degree, and I'm going to say, and a law degree, and I'm going to figure out how to move a mountain. And I'm going to chip away. And if I hadn't been wearing my own jersey, if I hadn't been thinking about what was important to me, not just in a career endeavor, but in personal ways as well, I would be lost. And I think that you really have to just wear your own jersey and do it with pride. And there will be naysayers. I don't care, because look how good Coats looks on this. I mean, it's like, this is embroidered, people. This is beautiful. What is that, velvet? It's beautiful. And I hope people do the same thing. And I'm laughing because I actually do keep it in my office, because every now and then I'll put it on and my okay goes, uh-oh, she got her jersey on. Someone mess with Laura. And I'm like, I got my jersey on today. So you know what that looks like, right? I got it on.
Oh, wow. I feel as if I need to go and create my own jersey, but it's coming. It's
and
give me time.
Unapologetically. Maybe it's a hoodie, maybe it's a tracksuit, maybe it's I don't know what you got, necklace, I don't know what you want, but wear it. Wear your own jersey, whatever that means to you.
Well, and so when I'm thinking about sort of how we sort of show up and bring all of ourselves to these conversations, there's a conversation where I think some people have trouble showing up, and so this is figuring out how to show up fully. And so one of the questions here in our chat is, how do we think about basically showing up to the conversation? This is from Randy Barba about the defund the police movement. How do we show up to that conversation?
Well, you know, you show up with more than a slogan. You show up with an explanation, and you show up with a plan. And because as you saw from even a phrase like that, how it provided off-ramps for people. It became almost like an opportunity to plug ears. They thought, oh, a slogan, never mind. Oh, how can you do that? That just means this, and it leaves room for interpretation. And I think in advocacy, you got to leave little room for interpretation. You got to say what you actually mean. And if you meant, which they did mean, if they meant a reallocation of resources, not having officers be viewed as a panacea, not having them be the jack of all trades when they're ill prepared to address mental health crises or going into the schools. I mean, I remember as a prosecutor, I'd have officers who were called to people's homes because a kid didn't want to put on his school uniform. Like that, and that's kind of the benign instances, right? Let alone the instances where somebody is having to go out and address a mental health crisis, and they're ill prepared to do it. And they know that, officers know that. They do not want to be thought of as a panacea. They want to have, like anyone else in a particular career, when you have limited resources and time and the expectation of perfection and no opportunity to be so, well, then you would like people to be able to delegate and delegate to the appropriate authorities without losing your ability to perform public service. And so I think when we talk about these issues in a world where we know the attention span of so many people is constrained to 280 characters on Twitter, we have to be able to have the headline and read all the way down the page and not give people an opportunity to turn a blind eye because the lead, the elevator pitch was flawed.
Yeah. And when I'm thinking about the lead, from Michael and others, a lot of concern about voting rights.
Mm-hmm.
Are we talking about voting rights in the right way? Is there a better way to think about how do we motivate some kind of legislative action on voting rights, and what tools does the DOJ still possess?
Well, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is something that should have been fortified long ago through a recalibration of the Section 5 formula. And we're talking about it now. We know there's political hurdles as to why that has not been. They haven't been resting on their laurels. There has not been the political urgency and appetite to do what the Supreme Court said to do when they gutted Section 5. And so we need to do that because, of course, that is the proactive, nipping in the bud aspect. Think of it as the proactive wing of Section 5, which means that you get the pre-clearance of the Civil Rights Division for making any voting-related change. And just to give you an idea of what those look like in practice, I have investigated jurisdictions where they changed the voting location to a known Klan hangout. Talk about voter intimidation, right? And in Washington, D.C., in the bubble, we don't necessarily know that this is why people don't want to go or why they'd be fearful, but in the community that's most impacted, they know. Or when you advertise on a Spanish language station and suddenly the election day is a different day than election day. Or when you do not allow for, or you have voter ID requirements where people realize the need to be who you say you are, but you make it impossible to be able to get the voter ID, or you accept, say, a gun license over a utility bill or a college ID because you do not want certain demographics to vote. These are things to realize what's going on. At Section 5 level, you could address it, resolve it before it even came into fruition. That was gutted. So you had Section 2, which, by the way, not just the DOJ can prosecute, but plaintiffs can bring cases. You have LDF talking about this. The Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights also talking about this issue. And being able to bring these cases. But the unfortunate part is that it's after the fact oftentimes. The law has already been enacted, it's implemented, and you are seeing it on election day more often than not, and an eye towards the future elections. So we have to get to the point where we can codify being proactive yet again. Otherwise, you see the clawing back. And the filibuster, of course, comes into play here. And you, I know, are a scholar of history as well, and we all, I'm sure, have our insight of what's going on. The conversation and off-ramp that often happens is, well, it wasn't initiated for racist reasons. Okay, you can quibble with Aaron Burr and what he was doing. I don't know, but he wasn't, look, what's his name, Lamar Odom in history. That's just what Lin-Manuel Miranda's vision was. He was not a Black man then, right? But you can quibble about that. But irrespective of that, in its modern application, it's been used to undermine civil rights legislation. It's been used to undermine even anti-lynching bills. And who was supposed to be against anti-lynching bills, right? It's not coincidental. And so the filibuster, if it presents the hurdle to even something as a predicate like voting rights, then what is the point of having the Senate? And I would just say this and close on that. We find all sorts of ways to do what you want to do, right? You heard Secretary Janet Yellen ringing the alarm about what it would look like, the perception of the United States of America defaulting on its debt unless we raise the debt ceiling, sounding the alarm of what it would mean to people's impression of this country. We changed it for that reason, but weeks later, we can't do it when it comes to voting rights, because what would it say about our country if we are so afraid to be in default, but let our democracy go bankrupt? That tells you a lot about where we are politically in this country.
And the last thing I'm going to ask is, can you talk about Jeopardy?
Jeopardy.
Alice Trebek.
Jeopardy. Well, I mean, I've said it before. Honestly, I was so excited. I've been a lifelong fan. I did not know him personally. When he said his statement about saying my name as a possible replacement, I was overjoyed. I was folding clothes in my house when I saw it come across the screen. And I thought, oh my God, I remember my kids said, Mommy, Alex Beckbeck, which is what they called him, Alex Beckbeck knows your name. Because truth be told, sometimes I actually watch it once in the night and then again when my kids are with me so I can sew all the answers correctly and prove that I'm a genius. They don't always believe it to my kids. So I was thrilled. And I was sad to see his passing. My own grandmother passed from pancreatic cancer, actually while I was in college at Princeton. And so I am always saddened to think about how it's claimed another life. I thought it was very kind of them to say so. And when a time came for, them to look for guest hosts, I raised my hand, I put on my jersey, I advocated for myself, and they said no in no uncertain terms. They did not find his statement to be persuasive. And I could go on with more details, but at the end of the day, I can tell you my calling has not changed. And it is still asking the right questions, answering the questions correctly, and keeping my community out of jeopardy. So I'll leave it there.
And that's a great place to leave it. So the time, of course, is never enough. But in our last minute, and I mean a minute together, we're offering you the last word. So take us home.
I'll say this. I'm really grateful to the community from Princeton to have embraced me. I've seen so many kind words said. I love the network we have. I hope that people continue to reach out and to know that I'm thinking of you, and I see that you're thinking of me. And I really hope you can continue to live your best lives and to pivot when necessary and be unapologetic about it. And shout out especially to one, I didn't mention this, but when I thought about going into media, part of my Panera Bread moment was reaching out to the Princeton network and finding a Princeton connection and asking, do you mind? I mean, I sent out hundreds of emails, and Princeton wrote back time and time again to say, no problem, I got you, sis, I'll help. And so I appreciate that, I still do. And I'm proud to be a part of this community still. And thank you for allowing me to come and talk tonight. And thank you, Fred, I appreciate it.
Now, this has been a real, when I say a pleasure, I mean a pleasure. And for those of you who don't already have Just Pursuit, I suggest that you wait no longer. And let me just ask the audience to join me in thanking Laura Coates, class of 2001, for bringing her full self to us this evening in pursuit of the just. So thank you, Laura, and thank you, all of those who are in our audience tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I want to read the comments. Don't close it out yet. You can go, but I want to read it. Hello. Hello.
We're not closing things off yet. This was honestly just an absolutely wonderful conversation, Laura. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks to Kevin and Anthony and everyone. You, of course, for doing this. And Eric, I appreciate it so much.
And I wanted to just check in. So we have actually posted a couple links in the chat to be able to buy your book actually at a Black-owned bookstore. So if anyone hasn't gotten the book yet, you can support a Black business. So go for, please buy the book. It's just amazing. And it's been such a powerful discussion. And we just really appreciate having you here.
Thank you. Well, please reach out. You can always find me.
Yeah.
I see the comments on it and asking for contact information. You can always find me, lcoates@lauracoates.com. Easiest to email me. But don't I keep business hours.
Me too. I get it. You gotta have boundaries. It's very important. I also wanted to note that we are having a event. The ABPA is having an event next week. Actually, we've actually gathered Princeton alumni to kind of discuss how they got involved in becoming alumni leaders. So we have everyone from our own ABPA president, Eric Plummer, to one of our trustees for Princeton University to kind of come and talk about what brought them to be leaders in Princeton alumni or in the Princeton alumni kind of network, and kind of making sure that their voices were heard, making sure that their voices were heard in our community, in the Princeton community. So we're really excited. Please be sure to look out for a flyer that should be coming up this week, and we will be sending out email blasts and everything for that as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Thanks, everybody.